So we had heard at the time, John, correct me where I'm wrong here, from the chief of police in Ferguson in those immediate days afterwards, that though there had been a report of the robbery of the Swisher cigarettes, we're now hearing they were, before we thought they were Cigarillos, I think, I don't know. But the box of cigarettes that were taken in that strong-armed robbery by the person who we now know was Michael Brown, that the officer in question, Darren Wilson, had never heard that report. He was coming from trying to rescue a sick black child, right? They love telling us that part. And that he just saw them walking down the middle of the street and told them to get off the street, because that's the kind of thing a police officer would do. That seemed reasonable to me. So now, when McCulloch gets up there today, he tells a very different story.
Exactly. So why don't we go to this next video? McCulloch is going to be talking about the situation between Darren Wilson and Michael Brown, and he's going to focus quite heavily on the actual robbery.
At approximately 11:45 a.m. on Saturday, the 9th of August, Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson was dispatched to the Northwinds apartment complex for an emergency involving a 2-month-old infant having trouble breathing. At approximately 11:53, while still at the Northwinds call, Wilson heard a radio broadcast for a stealing in progress at a market on West Florissant. The broadcast also included a brief description of the suspect, a black male wearing a white T-shirt who took a box of Swisher cigars. Officer Wilson then left Northwinds complex in this Ferguson police vehicle, SUV, and drove west on Canfield towards West Florissant. An additional description of the stealing suspect was broadcast about that time, wearing a red hat, yellow socks, khaki shorts, and he was with another male. As Officer Wilson was attending to his emergency call on Northwinds, Michael Brown and a companion were in a local convenience store on West Florissant. Michael Brown's activity in that story was recorded by the store's security cameras. The video, often played following its release in August by the Ferguson Police Department, shows Michael Brown grabbing a handful of cigarillos and heading toward the exit without paying. As Officer Wilson continued west on Canfield, he encountered Michael Brown and his companion still walking in the middle of the street. As Wilson slowed or stopped as he reached Mr. Brown, he told them to move to the sidewalk. Words were exchanged, and they continued walking down the middle of the street. As they passed, Wilson observed that Michael Brown had cigarillos in his hand and was wearing a red hat and yellow socks. At approximately 12:02 p.m., Wilson radioed that he had 2 individuals on Canfield and needed assistance.
So we know one thing is definitely true amongst what he said there. They did play the footage from the robbery multiple times in the wake of Michael Brown's killing, and then had to apologize for it when it became clear that it was irrelevant to the killing, and they were clearly just trying to make Michael Brown look like a criminal who deserved what he got.
Which he thought was appropriate to mention here. Again, because if he were seeking the indictment of Michael Brown, he probably would have got it.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but like we said, this doesn't actually comport with what we found out just days after the killing. Here is a video that J.R. Jackson pulled from back in August of the Ferguson police chief talking about what connection, if any, there was between the killing and the robbery.
This robbery does not relate to the initial contact between the officer and Michael Brown. I can only go up to a certain point, and then it's unreleased information in the investigation, and that certain point is the initial contact between the officer and Mr. Brown was not related to the robbery. I know his initial contact was not related to the robbery.
Run that by us again. Yes. You're telling us that you're telling us that when the officer stopped Michael Brown for the first time, he was not aware that Brown was a suspect in a robbery.
No, he was just coming off of a sick case, which is why the ambulance was there so quickly.
So let's stay with this. This is critical. Yeah. You're saying, what are you saying, Chief? Did he know that he was a suspect in a case, or did he not know?
No, he didn't.
He did not know.
So it had nothing to do with the stop.
So it had nothing to do with stopping.
So why did he stop him? At this point, why did he stop Michael Brown?
Because they were walking down the middle of the street blocking traffic. That was it.
Yeah, we often criticize them for not doing follow-ups. Thankfully, they're multiple times incredibly clear, not connected, and yet for some reason, Bob McCulloch decided to put 1 minute and 55 seconds into laying out the connection.
Yeah, so I don't what, of course, you know, and supposedly we're getting, I don't know, I don't believe anything these guys say, but are we going to get the full grand jury? Because I would have had the grand jury, again, if you were looking to prosecute, you would have called Tom Jackson, who was the Ferguson police chief who you just saw there, and said, now you said days after the shooting that Officer Wilson had no idea of the incident of the stealing the Swisher brand Cigarillos, I believe, unless it's Cigarillo brand Swishers.
I think you had it right the first time.
Yeah, I think it's the Swisher brand Cigarillos. So that you had no idea about that, then why now are we led to believe, I presume by Darren Wilson's testimony,
Yes.
that he had heard about that,
Yes.
and that he matched the description of the guy in the red hat and the khaki shorts and the yellow socks.
And by the way, there's no way to double check if Darren Wilson's lying when he says it, because all of a sudden his radio was on a different frequency and nobody knew him, and there's no recordings of what was happening.
So we've gone completely differently from what Tom Jackson, the chief of police, again, nobody here is an attorney for Michael Brown, what the chief of police said in August to what Bob McCulloch, the St. Louis County prosecutor, said yesterday, where now all of a sudden Darren Wilson knew, and again, that helps his frame of mind. He's dealing with a thief, right? A dangerous thief who used no weapon in that robbery, but nonetheless had committed a robbery.
Yeah, now a couple more stats I want to show for you, just because you know, we predicted before the announcement last night that they're probably. Oh, by the way, you lost a bet, didn't you?
I did, yeah. Steve,
you have to pay up to
$20.
Steve. We did not think that there would be an indictment, but at that time,
neither did I, but I'm a compulsive gambler.
Exactly, you just have to take it. You had odds.
Right.
But that was not because, that was despite the fact that at that point I did not know that in these sorts of cases, indictments are extremely common. Now we're going to show you this stat right here that the Washington Post put together, showing the likelihood that grand juries will actually have an indictment at the federal level. And I understand that what happened with Darren Wilson was not at the federal level. We don't have access to that information, but this is the information we do have. So if we can bring up graphic 1A, you see there, out of the 193,000 cases between 2009 and 2010, there were prosecutions in 162,000 of them. Of the more than 30,000 they didn't prosecute, only 11 were because the grand jury did not return an indictment. The other cases are either because they did not think after the indictment that there was enough evidence, or because someone else was investigating the case. So it's extremely rare to not have an indictment.
Or they made some deal with that person and
or
they
possibly,
cooperated, who knows why. But only when seeking an indictment out of 160 some odd thousand, only 11 times at the federal level did they fail to get an indictment.
So you can understand why that bet looked good to you.
That's the national security court level return. I mean, that's money in the bank. That's FISA return.
Yeah.
Right?
Can I just want to reiterate, drive home the point that this prosecutor, the way he handled the grand jury, completely different than every other grand jury case he's ever handled in his life, and completely different than every other prosecutor ever handles a grand jury case. So I saw someone else make this point last night. I would like to reiterate that. So now the next guy who's accused of murdering someone in St. Louis County, does he get to request the Darren Wilson treatment? You mean you're not going to lay out a narrative of how you thought I did it? You're just going to present all the information to the grand jury? Or do you only do that with Darren Wilson?
Yeah.
Because that's what they did. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to lay out a narrative as a prosecutor of how you think it happened. You're supposed to tell people what you think. This is what I think happened, and I'm not going to give you any of the defense. I'm not going to give you any shred of evidence that would show him to be not guilty of this. But what he did was he gave you overwhelming evidence that Darren Wilson was not guilty, which is not what a prosecutor does. So here's my problem. He's transparently he's transparently corrupt. He transparently wanted to block an indictment of him. And this guy's allowed to do this in broad daylight. He has no shame. He's not going to lose his job over this. I have the same feeling inside I had when we went to war in Iraq. Like, this is all happening out in the open, and nobody really is going to do anything about it. And people don't understand. I think we need to really explain. He's supposed to do the opposite of what he's doing, and he's doing it. And nobody's really did they allow to ask him questions at that press conference?
I don't know if there were questions.
He took a couple of questions, I believe, at the end. A couple of very few questions. He didn't answer much. He wouldn't reveal the vote You need it needs to be 9-3. There are 12 people on the grand jury. That
There was
varies.
9 whites and 3 blacks on that grand jury.
And you need
So I'm
9.
gonna guess it was 9-3.
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't.
We don't know.
I
I would be interested to find out, but
Be
we
interested
don't
to find out. I don't know whether we ever will. Eventually, you imagine somebody's going to talk to some grand jury members, and they'll give us some clue. But you know, Jimmy, to your point that you just made, imagine in a grand jury for a guy who'd murdered a police officer.
Yeah.
Right. And at some point in a violent rage, and at trial, they might say, this 16, 17-year-old kid was abused on a daily basis by his father.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
You think they're bringing that up to the grand
No.
frickin'
The
jury?
prosecutor
The prosecutor's
is bringing
gonna
that
go,
up?
Now, just before, I just want to let you know, abused every day by his drug-addicted father, beaten, and his sense of rebellion against authority was so extreme that when the cop knocked on his door, he saw that as a chance to get back at his father, which sounds like, I got to be honest, might be not guilty by temporary insanity. I'm going to leave that up to you.
Yeah. Well, it also brings...
because I know I might come up at trial. I don't want to go through that burden. I mean, it's ridiculous. And again, they spin it. You can, because I guarantee you can read it on Twitter, that you can read it on Facebook, because we heard it from Darren Wilson's friend on Fox. I said it before. They're going to repeat it. Like, not only did we not get an indictment from the grand jury, which is the American system that no one understands. Not only did we not get an indictment in this case, but he gave them everything. Whereas all he's supposed to give them is he's supposed to be the guy going after Darren Wilson. And what we haven't mentioned, and it bears repeating, is that, of course, the reason that so many people wanted him thrown off the case was twofold. One, at that point, he was 0 for 4 getting police officers indicted for when they killed unarmed people. Unarmed people, we're not talking about the armed people. 0 for 4 and unarmed people getting indictments. And in 1964, when he was a boy, his father was a police officer who was killed by a suspect. So all relevant information about Robert McCulloch, which is why either he should have perhaps recused himself, or the seemingly feckless governor of Missouri, Jay Nixon, should have stepped in and just picked someone from outside and said, this is who's going to come in and do it.